Okay, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Shiva Ayyadurai. One of my expertise is in the field called pattern recognition and mathematical analysis, so I'll try to keep it brief. But the objectives of this study were pretty focused to essentially perform an initial analysis on Maricopa County and to identify any anomalies and to provide an explanation for those anomalies. So that's what this today's discussion is focused on. At a very high level, many people probably know these numbers. If you look at the about 2.6 million people are registered to vote in Maricopa County. In this election, 80.5% of them cast ballots, as you can see there. And this is not showing the data for, let's say, the independent or Green parties, but 49.8% went to Biden and 47.6% to President Trump. So that was the reported results from the Secretary of State. The other important thing to note is that just to get one of the important features that you can look at in a election is a distribution of votes by party affiliation. So in this case, there was 35.3% of Republicans who voted, 31.3% of Democrats, 32.3% of independents, a small percentage of libertarians. That gives a total distribution. We'll come back to this, why this is important in this analysis. So what I want to first begin by having people put their attention on this chart. What this is we're literally taking all the data provided by the Secretary of State across the 743 precincts in Maricopa County, and we're literally recreating the election. And there are two curves here. One is the curve for President Trump, which is a red curve, and the blue curve is a curve for Mr. Biden. And as we move from left to right, what we're doing is we're starting with precincts which have low number of votes to precincts which have high number of votes. And we're literally counting the vote totals and summing them up together. When you get to the end here, you get the actual election results. So 49% for Mr. Biden and 47.6% for Mr. Trump. So these curves in many ways show the dynamic of the election as you move from the precincts from low vote counts to high, and you're essentially adding them up. So when you look at this curve in pattern recognition and pattern analysis, one of the things you try to understand is anomalies and the normal condition. So this is what we're calling the normal condition. In science, we'd call it the control. And we're literally looking at two important features. There's a shape of this curve, and there's the sequence and how this curve is developed. So in the analysis here, what we wanted to do was we wanted to see if we can reproduce the curve for President Trump and the curve for Mr. Biden by looking at the demographic of voters based on party affiliation, because that's one of the most easily accessible or one of the most prominent features in an election. So towards this, we initially did a initial analysis of looking at voter turnout in a precinct, percent voter turnout. So every dot here represents a particular precinct, and you're looking at the percent voter turnout in a precinct along the y-axis, and along the x-axis simply the percent registered Republicans in a precinct. And what's interesting is you see a positive correlation. The more percentage of Republicans in a precinct, in fact, voter turnout is going up. Alternatively, when we looked at the percentage voter turnout in a precinct by percent registered Democrats in a precinct, you see a negative relationship. As the percentage of Democrats in a precinct increases, each blue dot is a precinct, you see a negative correlation with voter turnout. And similarly, we see the same behavior in the registered independents in a precinct. Voter turnout, and you see the negative correlation. So in summary, for Republicans, where the percent turnout positively correlates with percentage registered Republicans in a precincts, for Democrats and independents, the percent turnout negatively correlates with percent registered Democrats and percent registered independents in precincts. So that's just giving you the feature of what was taking place in Maricopa County. Now, getting back to this, we have the capability, the computer affords us the opportunity to do what we call scenario testing. What are the potential scenarios of distribution of Republicans, Democrats, independents, libertarians, and Greens, that if you were to look at the potential infinite possibility of spaces, we haven't done all of them, but in the time that we have, what are the percentages of distributions of voters that would give rise to produce President Trump's curve here, and what are the percentages that would give rise of those allocations of Republicans, Democrats, Independents, Greens, and Libertarians to give rise to Mr. Biden's percentage. And the reason we want to do this is to look at the plausibility of these results. Is it plausible that you could have some reasonable distribution of Democrats, Republicans, Independents, Green to generate this very particular slope and these curves to get this net result? And remember, again, we're going from precincts from left to right, we're accumulating votes. So this is really 743 different data points. So what we first did, just to give you an idea, this is one of the potential scenarios where we're looking at, in the case of Democrats, we're looking at a split of votes between Mr. Biden and Trump of 20% to 80%, of Republicans between 80% to 20%, and of the Independents 70-30, Libertarians 0-100, and Green 100 zeros. This is one of the computer simulations. Like this, a computer can do far better than I could do sitting here. And what you see is the green line is trying to match Mr. Biden's blue line, and you can see it's way off. And the purple line is trying to match the red line. So obviously these aren't matching, because again, we wanted to see if we could overlay on those. So here's another potential scenario. In this case, we're looking at Biden-Trump voter distribution of Democrats by 80-20, Republican 20-80, the Independents 30-60, Libertarians 10-90, 100-0. And in this case, the blue line here, the purple line here is at least nearer the red line, and the green line is getting closer to Mr. Biden. So again, the green and the purple are the simulated versions. Then we do another example. Well, this is getting a little bit closer. We see 100% Democrat, 0% Trump for Democrat distribution relative to Republicans, 20-80 split, 36%, 58% on the Independents, and so on. But it's still not matching, even though it's getting close here. You notice the slopes aren't matching. Well, we try a different case, 100% Democrat, 0% Biden-Trump, Republican 0-100, and so on. Still doesn't match. This iteration process, again, with the computer was done, and the only one that we were able to come close to matching was this. And I want everyone to look at this carefully. So out of all the potential universe, which we've done, and we're going to continue doing this, by no means is this done, we find that the interesting possibility we find here is when the Democrat percentage is 130% Mr. Biden and negative 30% Mr. Trump, and the Republican percentage is 0-100, the Independent is 30%, 58%, Libertarian 0-60, 60-0. But what's extraordinary about this graph, again, we went through many, many, many iterations. It matches perfectly, near perfectly. The slopes match, the curves match, the shape match. So what this tells us is that this demographic distribution of allocation of party affiliations is what can generate this. And I find it highly implausible, because this means that Mr. Biden got 130% of Democrat voters and negative 30%, and President Trump got negative 30%. So how is this possible? So how is this quote unquote result possible? Well, one possibility could be there's a demographic within the independent voters, which is this group here, okay, this 58%, not visible in our model, who voted for Biden. Again, we would need to get more access to data, which is, by the way, very difficult to get access to. Another possibility is that Mr. Biden's actual votes were multiplied by 1.3, which is 130%, meaning each single vote Mr. Biden received, each single vote he actually received became 1.3 reported votes. There was an increase in a weighting of a vote that was given to Mr. Biden, and President Trump's votes are reduced by that 0.3 or 30% gained by Mr. Biden. Simply put, you could call this vote swapping, or there could be a combination of both. So that's what we have discovered today. But this combination, out of all the possibilities to match this curve perfectly, is the only one we found so far. and the demographic distribution that it asserts seems highly implausible. But again, we need to do more research. One is, again, as I mentioned, that there could be certain groups of independent voters that are not visible in the model, or it could be vote swapping, or all three. And I'll end on that note.
All right, Dr. Shiva. I'm looking at Mr. Giuliani, and I see he's been scratching some things out here. I'm pretty sure you have a question or two.
I do, sir.
Please, sir.
Doctor, it's Rudy Giuliani. How are you?
How are you, Mayor Giuliani?
Can I just ask you, how did you get to that calculation where Trump received minus 30% of the Democrat vote? Can you explain to us in a way that we can understand how you got to that calculation?
Sure. So let me go back to it, if I can go back to it. So think of this, Mayor Giuliani, as if you think about this, this is a curve that represents the actual vote, what's called the cumulative vote count for Mr. Biden and President Trump. Okay, so this is the control. This is what actually occurred on election night. Does that make sense? And what we're attempting to do in mathematics, using mathematics, you can do what's called curve fitting, where you can change certain variables to attempt to fit this curve. The variables we are changing here, which cannot be done, manually, but the computer is essentially changing the possibilities of different levers, a percentage of Democrats who voted for President Trump, the percent of Democrats who voted for Mr. Biden, the percent of Republicans who voted for Biden, the percent of Republicans who voted for Trump, the percent of independents who voted for Biden, the percent of independents who voted for Trump, and so on. So it's a solving where, remember in algebra where you could multiply variables by different equations, and you're trying to match this curve. So the computer is doing this, Mayor Giuliani, and so that's why I'm showing you these different possibilities. Now there's hundreds of thousands that the computer is running through to figure out what possible, as you can see here, what possible combination of these would lead to this. And the only one we were able to find was this. I hope that explains it. We're looking at the computer trying to find combinations of these vote allocations that could perfectly reproduce this result.
So a vote for Biden would actually be 1 1/3 vote. Is that correct?
Yeah, 1 3/10, right. So
1 3/10.
So when Biden got one vote,
1 3/10, and a vote for Trump would be 1.
A vote for Trump would be whatever the president got, if he got 100 votes, reduced by 30% of what Mr. Biden got. Basically, the president's vote is linked to the vote that Mr. Biden got. So if Biden got 100 votes and his went up by 1.3, which means it took 30% of the votes were reduced that would go to President Trump. So basically, votes are being eaten from President Trump and handed over to Mr. Biden. That's the only way to, one possibility of explaining.
Did you discuss this at all with Colonel Waldron?
I received a text message from this earlier, and in preparation for this, I wasn't able to get to him, but I'm willing to discuss that with him.
Well, he reached a very similar conclusion in a different way, that the votes for Biden were valued within the computer algorithm as higher than the votes for Trump. Could you accomplish that within a computer that you had gotten control of?
Well, one of the important things to recognize is that what we do know is, starting in 2002, Mayor Giuliani, that these voting vendors, that was brought out in one of the Diebold manuals, have a feature called the weighted race feature. The weighted race feature, it's a documented feature. And the weighted race feature basically says that the feature in the software, which the secretaries of state have certified, knowingly or maybe unconsciously, but they must have certified these electronic voting system software, has a feature called a weighted race feature, which allows a voter's vote to be or a candidate's votes to be multiplied. So what that means is the central principle Justice Earl Warren ruled on in 1964, one person, one vote, or clarified that, can be violated. It can be one person, not one vote. And that is one explanation of this. But the important feature I think people in the public need to understand is these software systems, the electronic voting software systems, have a documented feature called a weighted race feature. So the implementation of this is very possible. In fact, it's a documented feature starting as early as 2002.
Is there any reason for that? Any legitimate reason? Don't you want to count every? Don't you want to count every vote as one?
Every vote should be counted as one vote, but the fact that a weighted race feature exists should be a serious concern to all of America, because it basically means that all of us have been going, we're going back to Dred Scott, where it means that all of us, in some ways, the ubiquity of unfairness, where at that time it was 3/5 of a vote, where we could all become, 1/3 of the vote. In this case, the people who voted for President Trump approximately were becoming 7/10 of the vote.
Do you know if the Dominion machines have that weighted vote feature?
As I understand, if the fact that the votes are stored as decimal fractions means you could have external programs intersect, communicate with those programs and alter them using external software programs, which could also do weighted race features. But the important element here is that there's documented features of the weighted race feature as early as 2002, and our votes are stored as decimal numbers.
Would I be overly simplistic if I concluded the only reason you would want a machine with a weighted vote feature is in order to cheat?
It's enabling cheating. It's an enabling of one person, not one vote.
I mean, this is not a poll.
That's what the feature enables.
This is not a poll. This is an absolute vote. And the only reason to have that feature would be if you're going to distort the vote.
Exactly.
Wow. Do you know what a Monte Carlo is?
Excuse me, Mayor Giuliani?
Did you do a Monte Carlo where you can do millions of possibilities in a minute to find a good match?
Yes, so that's what this is doing. There are many different techniques. The solver technique here, there are many different numerical methods, but essentially it's doing one of those kinds of approaches to find that fit. Exactly.
And that's how you arrived at the one that you felt was the closest?
Yes.
And could you say with a degree of professional certainty that there's no question that this vote count in Arizona is faulty, false, not accurate, whatever words are comfortable?
Well, I think what I can say is that the plausibility of that, the cumulative vote count as we see it progress is highly implausible. The caveat being we don't have certain data on the, what percentage of demographics of independent voters, but from everything we've run and the simulations we've run, it's highly implausible the pattern of voting we saw that was reported by the Secretary of State of Arizona in Maricopa County.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Members, any questions for Dr. Shiva? Any questions? Representative Cook, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a question for the doctor. So earlier we had heard from a state senator, I believe, and in his presentation, when it had the vote totals, it had a decimal point and then numbers after. And so this perfectly makes sense if what you're saying is one vote is one vote, two votes is two votes. But if there's some way there's something added to it electronically to have a weighted vote as a 1.25, so every vote for this person is a 1.25, would that be the way those decimal points got there?
Well, yeah. I mean, the issue is why are our votes being stored not as whole integers, versus what we're called floating point variables in computer science or in math, right? So when a developer writes a program, it should be very important. I've been programming for many, many years. And the first thing you learn is when you are writing a software program, you have to be extremely conscious on how you're declaring variables, right? This variable is an integer, which means it can only be, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This variable is going to be a decimal, which is also called a float or a double, which means it can be 1.1, 1.3, so on. So the fact that the vote count is stored as a decimal, to me, when I first learned about this in my own Senate race here in Massachusetts, was quite disconcerting, because this means that consciously people are putting into the software a capability to have fractional voting. And that's what this leads to. And why is there such a feature or capability, and why are our votes even being stored as fractions or decimals? And I think this is probably the central question of our time, probably going back to, the 3/5 compromise of 1787. Do we have one person, one vote, or do we have one person, not one vote? And in the era of electronic software systems, I think the courts need to step in and re-clarify one person, one vote, going back to 1964, the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution.
Mr. Chairman.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we got a lot of ground to cover here, so I appreciate your passion, but can we just keep the applause to let's wait until we're done. Senator Borelli, you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I'm not surprised. It's pretty much the modus operandi of the Democrat history anyway, to have a poll tax and actually tax the Republican to that vote goes to a Democrat. So that's what they did. They took that 30% or 0.3, whatever, tax the Republican vote and send it over to the Democrats. So I'm not surprised that the Democrats would want to tax the vote.
Mr. Chairman.
Okay, members, any other questions?
I
Makes
wasn't
sense.
finished.
I'm sorry?
I wasn't finished, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, I'm sorry. Please proceed, Mr. Cook. I thought you were done.
Thank you. I just wanted to finish up with what we're going to talk about. So now that we understand with the two witnesses that we've heard here today, how those decimal points gets in there, and Doctor's done a wonderful job. The question I have, Mr. Chairman, is when did you find this information about where the lines transected? At what point in time were you made aware of it? That's the first part of the question. And the second part of the question is, who have you made aware of this? Have you made the Secretary of State of Arizona aware of this, or the Governor's Office or Attorney General's aware of this? Or has it just been the privileged information of the Trump team until now, just about the state of Arizona, so we keep it short?
No, this was discovered about 24 hours to 48 hours ago. You're the first ones to actually see these graphs presented today.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your time.
Yeah. Representative Townsend.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a quick question built off of a comment. Sidney Powell had mentioned some conflicts of interest with Dominion and these systems. She had said, her words were, governors and secretaries of states and other politicians have a vested interest in this system. I read from last year an article where Nancy Pelosi's former chief of staff sat on the board of the lobbying firm that represents Dominion. If what you're telling us is true, and there is some kind of interest by certain politicians to invest in this kind of a system, and I find it ironic that today is Cyber Monday and we're talking about this type of issue. Have you looked at that, of any kind of a nefarious background when you're looking at these weighted votes? Do you have any indication or any suspicion, or is this just a mistake or a fluke in data? Does this lend to her claim that there might be some nefarious motives behind this system?
It's a very, very good question you bring up. Let me give you from my own actual experience in this. I ran for U.S. Senate in the Republican primary in Massachusetts. And I was deeply shocked when I found out that this weighted race feature existed. And pursuant to that, we issued FOIAs to actually get access to some very important data, which helps us connect to validate whether the weighted race feature was on. And that is called the ballot images the cast vote records, and it's called the list vote records. Now, what are those things? When you put a ballot into a machine, a paper ballot, and that machine is scanned, that machine creates what's called an image, a photograph. And when tabulation takes place, guess what's tabulated? Not the paper. In the electronic voting machines, the actual images. Does that make sense? So the images are tabulated. So when you get a result, if you want to validate the integrity of that result, the output, we must have access to the ballot images, and because the ballot images are used to generate the cast vote records and the list vote records, which are the actual counts of votes that were gotten. So when in Massachusetts, for example, I applied for a FOIA to get this. The Secretaries of State of Massachusetts, and I believe this may be true in many Secretaries of State across the country, they responded back to me saying they deleted the ballot images. In fact, they destroy them, that they don't have to save them by state law. And it is my understanding, pursuant to USC 20701 and 20702, for federal elections, those ballot images must be saved in order to validate the integrity of the election. Well, in my case, when I started sharing this on Twitter on September 25th, the Secretary of State of Massachusetts contacted Twitter and shut me down for 21 days left in my election. And what came out in testimony in Massachusetts with a federal judge here was that the Secretary of State of Massachusetts has a special partnership with Twitter where they were able to brand what I was sharing, that ballot images were destroyed, as election misinformation. And in addition, they called the National Association of State Election Directors, NASED, which is the association of all the state election directors, and they too got involved in contacting Twitter to shut down my tweets where I was exposing that ballot images, which were destroyed, which would be the evidence showing that the weighted race feature was on. It was quite extraordinary. Well, the NASED is the group of all state election directors. So why was my tweet, when Twitter had not shut me off when I was talking about election fraud, but the state of Massachusetts Secretary of State and the state election directors found it threatening, because what I was essentially stating was that the state election directors of a number of these states are concealing the actual evidence which directly correlates which can expose whether weighted race feature was on. So yes, I do believe it's nefarious. And if you go look at the National Association of State Election Directors, which is a nonprofit, they are funded, and they're an entity of Democracy Works. Democracy Works is funded by Rockefeller Brothers. It is also funded by the Murdochs, Catherine Murdoch. And you can look at who is actually controlling the state election directors, or what community are they part of. Now, why is this important? Because the state election directors and the secretaries of state are the ones who certify electronic voting systems, which means, are they certifying electronic voting systems knowingly with the weighted race feature? And in my view, I know in Massachusetts, that's what was done. And knowingly telling people, telling the vendors to delete ballot images, which are the evidence that interconnect the weighted race features being on and the ballot images. So in Massachusetts, the factory settings of these electronic voting machines, the default factory setting is to save all ballot images. What we discovered in Massachusetts is they tell the vendors to set that to off, which means delete, destroy all ballot images. And I believe that many of these secretaries of state are involved in this. So yes, I believe it is nefarious.
Thank you. And I just as a follow-up, I believe, and I was told recently that in Maricopa County with the machines in the Dominion, that
Nefarious.
Thank you. And I just as a follow-up, I believe, and I was told recently that in Maricopa County with the machines in the Dominion, that in the RFP request for the procurement, that it says you are able to, this allows you to publish the images, and that we were requesting that those be published, and we have been denied that. So I'm in communication with the Board of Supervisors to see, is it possible to go ahead and put that up? So I would recommend the public also get involved in demanding to be able to see those, because, apparently we have leaders in the state elbow bumping today in celebration of the certification of this election. And clearly what you're saying, we should be doing anything but. It's abhorrent, it's a shameful thing. That's a sad day in Arizona that we're celebrating the certification of this election.
Mr. Giuliani, do you have any follow-up questions you'd like to ask?
I would just like the doctor to state his credentials.
Dr. Shiva, would you please state your credentials?
Sure. My name is Dr. Shiva Ayyadurai. I hold 4 degrees from MIT. My undergraduate is in electrical engineering and computer science. I have 2 other masters. One is in scientific visualization from the MIT Media Lab, my master's. I also hold another master's from MIT in mechanical engineering, and my PhD is in a field called computational systems biology. And when I was 14 years old, I created the first email system while working as a full-time research fellow at Rutgers Medical School. And at that time, I began trying to understand sleep patterns in babies, why babies were dying in their sleep, and looking at patterns of signals to detect the anomalous signal and a normal signal. So the common thread throughout my entire life from the age of 14 till today has been pattern analysis, applying it to detect sleep patterns, handwriting recognition, and speech recognition, face analysis, understanding the analysis of signals to detect flaws in aircraft wings of airplanes or bridges. But pattern recognition is my field of expertise. And so what I just shared with people today is using that expertise to understand an anomalous situation, a implausible situation relative to normal situations. But in addition to my academic training, my industry background across the 7 companies I've done is starting companies and running companies which focus on pattern analysis and pattern recognition, a whole host of industries. But that's my background, Mayor Giuliani.
Quite impressive.
Thank you, Dr. Shiva. And frankly, this is just an observation so far. We have heard a couple of terms thrown around, and I think rather carelessly, and I think you've put a very fine point on it. One is, these machines are supposed to tabulate. They're not supposed to calculate. They're just supposed to count one for one. And I think you've put a very fine point on the notion that these aren't tabulation machines. These are machines that calculate and were built to do so. So I just want to thank you very much for making yourself available to us. And